Once more, Jesus spoke to them, that's the chief priests and the elders of the temple. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those whom you have invited, look, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made a light of it and went away, one to his farm and another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. And then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited are not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. And the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" The gospel of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious God, you have invited us to hear your message of grace, to the feast of love that you have given and spread for us. As we consider what sort of an invitation that is today, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strong rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. So the last 5 weeks now, we have been hearing different parables by Jesus. And when we began this series, I said, the thing about these parables about the kingdom is they mess with our minds in order to claim our hearts. God messes with our understandings of reality and our concepts of what life here on earth is. And he says the kingdom of heaven is like this. And the more and more we think about it, we find out that the kingdoms of this earth and the kingdoms of heaven are not alike at all. And I think when we finally recognize that, there's gratitude for that difference. We're now in the third of a series of 3 judgment parables. And it's important to remember the context of which Jesus speaks when he's telling these stories, and who his audience is when he shares these parables. Jesus, as we may remember, it's the last week of his life. He is facing certain judgment. He has rode into the capital city of Jerusalem, a place that is run by religious festivals. It's the convention business that drives the money into that community. The Holiday Inn is filled 3 times a year for religious festivals. Untold amounts of money are spent on burnt offerings, and it's a racket. It's a religious sin management racket. Some of us went to see the Luther movie last night. We had just about 40 people from our community in Bemidji, and it had been supported and sponsored throughout all of the churches. And can I show a little Lutheran pride? And saying, I think we had I think we had the largest contingent there. So, but we heard, not that how many people shows up merits our grace or honor before God, but we heard about it's not how much money you spend, it's not what kind of clothes you wear that define us as Christians, that the Christians aren't the good people or the ones who can offer a larger offering at the temple. The Reformation was about that too. Just like Jesus' fight in the temple, the Reformation was about when St. Peter wanted to build St. Peter's basilicas, and if you wanted to give, I could erase your relative's time in purgatory or judgment. Okay, just give the money the church a little bit more cash, and we can spring your loved one out of hell. And so Jesus, when he rides that donkey to the temple steps and he drives out the money changers, he's taking on a racket. He's taking on a sin management system that defines ancient Israel. And then he has the audacity to come back the next day. And that's where the chief priests and the scribes say, by what authority are you doing this? By whose authority are you doing this? And so Jesus begins telling parables. That's the context of our gospel for today. First, he told the parable of the two sons. One who said he'd go to work, didn't show up. The other one who said, I'm not coming to work, Dad. And then came and did the work that was to be done. And that is a story and an allusion to the chosen people of God. The chosen people of God, God's first chosen son, if you will, not doing that which God had intended. And the Gentiles, and Jews as well, a new coming, a new testament of what it means to follow Jesus and to do God's will. Last week we heard about the wicked tenants, the tenants who take over the vineyard and seize the slaves, the Old Testament prophets, and kill them and drive them out. And finally, the owner of the vineyard sends his son, sends Jesus, and he's killed too. Today we hear the third parable of judgment against the chief priests and the elders of the temple. We hear the parable of the wedding banquet. So that's our context. Jesus near death, taking on a massive system of mismanagement, sin mismanagement, representing God's will in an inaccurate way. I think I said this last week, but I think it bears repeating. We need to be very careful here that this isn't God's utter and total judgment against the Jews, which we also learned about on Wednesday, was twisted. Some of Luther's teachings were twisted by Adolf Hitler to justify the Holocaust. There was a group of people in first century Judaism who weren't doing their jobs. And Jesus' judgment is against them and their particular mismanagement in that particular time. Okay? That does not mean a removal of the Jewish people of God, the chosen people of God, from the promises of God. Got that? We're good. All right. So the banquet, or the story begins. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. The king has invited everyone into the kingdom for a wedding banquet for his son. Who's the king? Anyone? God. Who's the son? Jesus. Yeah. Way to go, class. That was good. So God sends his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Now, this is no idle invitation. It's not well, I'll go to the king's party if it fits my schedule. It's not that kind of a deal. A couple weeks ago, the Minnesota Lynx won the WNBA championship. Way to go, gals. Way to represent Minnesota, because the men haven't been able to win anything for like 40 years. Good luck today against the Packers. But in the wake of that, Rebecca Brunson, one of the starting forwards for the team, says, when we are invited to the White House, we're not going to go. I'm not going to go. Following what Stephen Curry said when the Golden State Warriors won the NBA title a while ago, because of apparent political frustrations in the direction of the United States. And this is big news on CNN and the ESPN and the 24-hour networks, right? You've heard about this maybe? How can you refuse an invitation to the White House? Refusing an invitation to go to the king's banquet? Bigger deal. Much bigger deal. Not trying to make a political statement there either way, folks. It's just not going to the king's wedding banquet for his son is a bigger deal than not going to the White House, okay? Just in terms of a perspective. This is about our eternal salvation. This is about the choices that we make in the midst of busy lives and what is important and what is not. What is finally worth living for and dying for? So 3 things before I end the sermon that I'd like to share with you today that come out of this. The first thing, probably the most important thing, is this is a story about God's persistent love for us, okay? God's persistent desire to draw us into relationship with each other and with God. How many of you feel like it's kind of awkward that we shake hands twice during church? This whole thing that this new pastor brought in. Yes, AJ, you even told me I don't like touching people. Come on, I like my own space. All right. That's what we do as liturgy, is we act the way we want to believe, even when it doesn't feel right. You know, in a little while, we're going to take up an offering to support the ministry of this church. Some of you might be thinking, I'd rather keep that money to myself. Thank you very much. Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so what you treasure and what you do liturgically and what you do in worship becomes who you are. You're not already that person. You say, well, if I was only the person I wish I could be, I'd support these things more in my life. The Goths at the time of when they were being baptized and becoming Christians were great warriors, okay? And so when they would be baptized in the waters, they would lift their arm out of the water. Full submersion baptism, none of this sprinkling like we do here. And so the priests didn't know why did they lift their arm out of the water? Well, because the Goths were great warriors, and they felt like if they got baptized into the love and peace of Jesus, they couldn't fight anymore. So they kept their fighting arm out of the water so they could still be warriors and Christians too. Sometimes I think we as Christians come to our faith kind of like this. We get baptized, but we keep our wallet up out of the water. Watch that for me, will you? This parable is about God's relentless love, God's patient invitation, that everything is about what God does for us. I know Boyson is in grammar class right now where they're diagramming sentences and learning what's the subject and what's the verb and what's the object of the verb, who's doing the acting. Tell me, when you hear the 23rd Psalm today, who's the actor? He makes me lie down in green pasture. Who's the actor? God, the shepherd, or God. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. God. His rod and staff, they comfort me in the times of most deep darkness. God prepares a table for me. Pure gospel, pure grace, relentless invitation into a relationship with God. Second thing about today's story is that when, if you will, the chief priests and the scribes and the people did not show up to the banquet, he says, go out and invite everyone, wealthy and poor, good and bad, those in right standing in the church and those that we kind of wonder about. Bring them all in, good and bad. So what part of being invited to the banquet is about being good enough? Huh? What part of being a part of God's family is about having a thicker wallet than someone else? This church, this community, needs a place where anyone is welcome. Where the broken and the people that are in pain have a place. Where they know that they're loved. And they know that they're of great worth. Our eldest elders and our teachers and our youngest children, the people that society or the kingdoms of this world say are of no value, God values. Faith Lutheran values. We value together. The grace of God has no limits. The grace of God is beyond what we think church is, to the point where the most important member of this church is the one that hasn't walked through the doors yet. That's the person that we exist for as a community. Third thing, the issue here really ultimately in this parable is about choices that we do make. Okay? And we often trade not the bad for the good. We'd have a fighting chance if that was the case. We often trade the good for the great. Okay? 23rd Psalm, we need a shepherd because sheep nibble themselves lost. Okay? And we often nibble off at the very good things. So I have somebody that comes to me in a former parish, and she says, we need a support group here for adults whose children have made bad decisions. Okay? We need a support for the guilt we feel and the shame we feel because our children's marriages are failing, and they're separated and lost and confused, and they don't go to church anymore. And I empathize with this woman. I really do. I deeply do. But it was almost to the point where if my family doesn't look right in the sight of the world, if we don't have the white picket fence, if we don't have everything that everybody in this world thinks we should have, we should be ashamed. Divorce is biblical, folks. It's here. It happens. Okay? So how do we pick those things up and love each other again and not shame each other? How are we community for each other? The idol of making the good for the great is that there's supposedly some idealistic notion of what it looks to be the perfect family. Another thing, and it's in the front page of the Star Tribune, is what's happening to our young people when they pursue sports year-round, at the exclusion of school, of church, of community, of classwork, because we want our child to win. We want our child to be better than all the other kids. We don't want our child to learn what it's like to be a part of a team on the bench. We want them to start. We want them to be the star. I've coached sports for the last several years with our boys. I want them to learn what it means to lose. I want them to learn what it means to contribute and not always have to be the star of the team. Because the world keeps score, folks. The world will keep score when we take a job. The world will keep score when we apply for college. The world will keep score when we go to conferences and we see what kind of grades our kids are getting, right? And if that's what it means to be worthwhile, whether we get an A or a B, or whether we have a large home or a small home, we're lost. We're lost already. We've traded the good things for the great thing. That we are justified sinners, held in the grace of God in this community. And that's the foundational point in which our lives have bearing and worth to one another. And whether we win the game or whether we lose the game, Whether the Packers win today or the Vikings win today, we are still the people of God, right? It's who we are. Welcome to the wedding banquet. Serve today at this communion rail, where we will kneel next to each other, side by side, as equals, as children of God. Welcome home. Amen.